When a video game dispute starts sounding like a parody of corporate warfare written by a very bored sitcom writer, you know you are in dangerous territory. Because this is not just another publisher versus studio story. This is the kind of story where a Delaware judge basically looked at a gaming exec, looked at a chatbot, looked at a $250 million bonus on the line, and seemed to think, oh, so we are doing this the stupid way. And honestly, I respect the commitment to bad decisions. The whole thing is so absurd that it almost feels illegal in a comic sense before it became illegal in a court sense. Here is the setup. Krafton bought Unknown Worlds, the studio behind Subnautica, in 2021 for $500 million upfront, plus up to $250 million in earnout payments. The deal also gave the key employees meaningful operational control over the studio, including authority over product, roadmap, launch planning, partnering, budgeting, and employee matters, while the earnout was tied to revenue through the end of 2025, with an option to extend into June 2026. In other words, this was not a vague good vibes agreement. This was a contract with actual teeth, actual money, and apparently not enough humility for everybody involved. And then the situation somehow got even more embarrassing. According to the Delaware Court of Chancery's opinion, Krafton CEO worried he had agreed to a pushover contract and consulted an artificial intelligence chatbot to come up with a corporate takeover strategy. I need you to sit with that for a second. Not a seasoned legal mastermind, not a cold strategic boardroom shark, a guy apparently asking a chatbot, how do I wriggle out of this giant payment without looking like I'm wriggling out of this giant payment? That is not business strategy. That is the LinkedIn version of asking a magic 8-ball to help you commit a felony. The court says the chatbot helped shape what happened next. Krafton formed an internal task force called Project X, which frankly sounds less like a corporate initiative and more like the name of a villain's budget cutscene in a sci-fi movie. The task force's goal was either to negotiate a deal on the earnout or take over Unknown Worlds. Krafton then followed much of the AI-generated advice by pushing public messaging, locking down publishing access, and moving against the studio leadership. If you ever wanted proof that bad ideas can scale when they are given a deck title and a calendar invite, there it is. And yes, the court opinion is as dramatic as the facts. It says Krafton locked Unknown Worlds out of its own publishing platform to stop the release of Subnautica 2, posted critical messages on the studio's website, and then abruptly terminated Charlie Cleveland, Max Maguire, and Ted Gill. Later, Krafton changed its story and tried to claim other reasons for the firings, including alleged semi-retirement and data downloads, but the judge found those explanations pretextual. That is the kind of legal backpedaling that makes a smoke alarm sound polite. What makes this especially funny, in a dark corporate comedy sort of way, is how hard everyone seems to have tried to make the situation look normal after it had already stopped being normal. The opinion says Kim deleted specific relevant ChatGPT logs. That is not exactly the kind of thing that calms a judge down. It is the legal equivalent of trying to hide a spilled glass of red wine by putting a napkin over a lake. Sure, technically the surface is covered. No, the problem is not solved. The judge's remedy was brutal and honestly kind of elegant. Ted Gill was reinstated as CEO of Unknown Worlds with full operational authority over the studio. The court also said he could proceed with the early access release of Subnautica 2 when he deemed it appropriate. That is a remarkable sentence. Imagine being a publisher, spending months trying to squeeze the studio, and then ending up with a court order that basically says, congratulations, the person you fired is back, he controls the launch and your little control tricks do not count. That is not a win. That is getting turned into a cautionary tale with a legal filing number. Even better, the court extended the earnout period by the amount of time Gill was wrongfully out of the job. That matters because the judge apparently did not want Krafton benefiting from the delay it helped create. In plain English, you do not get to throw the game board into the wall and then complain that the timer ran out while you were standing there holding a brick. The court also said it would not restore Cleveland and Maguire to their previous roles because Gill's restored authority was enough to fix the breach. That part is less cinematic, but it matters because this was not just a headline about one fired CEO. It was a complete correction of the control grab the court found was improper. Now, my honest opinion, this is one of the most beautiful examples of you should have stopped while you were behind I have seen in a long time. Because if your plan is to avoid paying a huge bonus, and your first move is to ask ChatGPT for a strategy, and your second move is to execute something called Project X, and your third move is to lock the studio out of its own publishing tools, you're not doing corporate chess, as you are doing corporate interpretive dance with the blindfold on, and the judge saw every step of it. What I also like about this story is that it cuts through the weird myth that AI automatically makes things smarter. Sometimes it just makes people more confident while they make the exact same dumb decision, only now with more formatting. The AI did not invent greed. It did not invent panic. It did not invent the desire to dodge a contract. It just gave the bad idea a paragraph structure. The real comedy here is not that a chatbot was involved. The comedy is that somebody apparently thought a chatbot could turn a bad faith plan into a respectable one. That is not how technology works. That is how overconfident people get themselves dragged into court. And let us be honest about the human side of this. Subnautica 2 was supposed to be a major release, and the court said the game had been on track for early access before Krafton's intervention. So instead of letting the studio finish the job, the conflict turned into a legal mess, fan confusion, stalled control, and a public humiliation for everyone involved. That is the part I find genuinely tragic underneath all the jokes. Game development is already hard enough without adding a publisher-led self-own that reads like it was drafted by a consultant who had one eye on the contract and the other eye on the eject button. Krafton, for its part, has said it disagrees with the ruling and is considering its legal options while continuing work on Subnautica 2. So this is not necessarily the end of the story, but right now the court record is pretty clear. The judge found Krafton breached the agreement, found the justifications for firing the leadership were pretextual, and restored Gill's authority over the studio and launched decisions. That is a legal disaster wrapped inside a corporate embarrassment, wrapped inside one of the most unintentionally funny AI stories of the year. And that to me is why this whole situation is going to get remembered. Not because it is polished, not because it is heroic, not because anyone looks smart. It will be remembered because it is a perfect modern mess, a huge company, a huge bonus, a beloved game, a chatbot, a takeover plan, a courtroom, and a judge who essentially said, no, you do not get to do that. It is the kind of story that makes you laugh first and then immediately realize somebody probably spent months creating this disaster. That is the real punchline. The punchline is effort, enormous, expensive, deeply misguided effort. Now let's zoom out for a second, because this story is also a symptom of something bigger in the industry. Earnout structures like this one are actually very common when big publishers acquire smaller studios. The idea is simple. You pay part of the money up front and the rest depends on performance. It is supposed to align incentives. The studio wants to succeed because it gets paid more, and the publisher wants the studio to succeed because, well, they paid $500 million for it. But here's the problem. Earnouts only work when both sides trust each other. The moment one side starts thinking, how do I minimize this payout, instead of how do we maximize the success, the entire system breaks. And what you saw here, according to the court, is exactly that breakdown. Not gradual, not subtle, immediate and aggressive. And this is where the comedy turns into a bit of a warning. Because if you are a developer watching this situation unfold, what you're really seeing is a nightmare scenario. You sell your studio, you agree to performance-based bonuses, and then the other side allegedly starts trying to rewrite the rules mid-game. That is the kind of thing that makes future studios a lot more cautious about acquisition deals. There is also a very modern twist here that is worth talking about. The involvement of AI is not just funny, it is symbolic. We are entering an era where executives have access to tools that can generate strategies, arguments, and entire plans in seconds. And that creates a dangerous illusion. Speed feels like intelligence, output feels like insight. But courts do not care how fast your bad idea was generated, they care whether it violates a contract. And in this case, the judge basically looked at the entire sequence of events and said this was not a legitimate business decision, this was a coordinated attempt to avoid contractual obligations. That is a very serious conclusion, even if the story around it sounds like a meme. Also, let's not forget the public relations side of this disaster. Subnautica is not just any game. The first one sold millions of copies, built a massive fanbase, and became one of the most beloved survival games ever made. So when news like this hits, it is not just lawyers reading it, it is players, it is fans, it is people who are actually excited about Subnautica 2. And what do they see? Delays, drama, corporate conflict, AI, strategy memes. That is not exactly the marketing campaign you want before an early access launch. If anything, this situation shows how fragile hype can be. You can spend years building anticipation, and then one legal conflict can completely dominate the conversation. And here is a slightly uncomfortable take. None of this was necessary. That is what makes it funny and painful at the same time. This was not some unavoidable external crisis. This was not a market crash or a global issue. This was a series of decisions, human decisions, very questionable human decisions. Which brings me back to the AI angle one more time, because it is too good to ignore. There is something deeply ironic about using cutting-edge technology to try to execute what is, at its core, a very old-school move. avoiding paying what you owe. It is like using a supercomputer to calculate how to sneak out of a restaurant without paying the bill. Yes, the tool is advanced, the behavior is not, and the judge, to their credit, treated it exactly that way. Another interesting detail from reporting is that the court emphasized restoring the balance of control rather than micromanaging the company. That is actually important. The goal was not to run Unknown Worlds from the courtroom. The goal was to undo what the court saw as improper interference and put decision-making back where it contractually belonged. That is why Gil's reinstatement matters so much. It is not just symbolic, it is structural, and from a storytelling perspective, it is also perfect. Because every good story needs a reversal, and this one has a very clean one. The person removed from power is put back in charge with authority explicitly recognized by a court. You could not script it better. Well, unless you are using ChatGPT apparently. At the end of the day, what you are left with is a story that feels like a satire of the modern tech and gaming industry, except it is real, documented and legally binding. It has everything: massive money, corporate maneuvering, AI involvement, public drama, and a judge who was clearly not impressed. And if you made it this far, first of all, respect. Second, if you enjoy breakdowns like this, where we mix real facts with a bit of sharp commentary, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it tells me you want more deep dives into situations that are equal parts informative and absurd, because trust me, the gaming industry is not running out of material anytime soon. And with that said, thank you for watching, I really appreciate your time, and I will see you in the next video.